Have you ever looked at something ordinary and thought it was worthless, only to find out later it was the most important thing in your life? Because that is exactly what happened in this story. An old woman planted a few simple trees in her yard. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just quiet, ordinary trees. But her son and daughter-in-law looked at those trees and said, "Why are these still here? They make the yard look messy. We should cut them down." And for a while it seemed like they were right, until the day they dug near the roots. And what they found there changed everything. Because deep under those roots, hidden by time, soil, and silence, was a secret their ancestors had left behind. A secret treasure, and not just gold, something far more powerful. Something that could heal a family that had been broken by greed, pride, and misunderstanding. So stay with me, because this story starts with trees, but it ends with the kind of truth that can make a grown person cry. Before we begin, I want you to imagine a small old house at the edge of a quiet neighborhood. The kind of house people drive past without noticing. The paint was fading a little. The gate made a soft sound when it opened. And in the yard, near the front, grew a few trees that looked simple and harmless. They were not the kind of trees people would stop to admire. No flowers, no fruit, no dramatic shape. Just strong roots, green leaves, and a peaceful shadow on hot afternoons. Those trees had been planted years ago by an old woman named Mrs. Elena. She was the kind of woman people often misunderstood. She didn't talk much. She didn't wear bright clothes. She moved slowly, with careful steps, as if she had already lived through enough pain to know that life should never be rushed. Her son Daniel lived with her, and Daniel's wife, Megan, had recently moved into the house too. At first, everyone thought the arrangement would be nice. Family under one roof. A mother who needed care. A son who wanted to help. A daughter-in-law who wanted a fresh start. But life is never as simple as it looks from the outside. Sometimes the people in the same house are the loneliest people in the world. And that was true in this home. Mrs. Elena had planted those trees one by one, many years earlier. Back then, the yard had been empty. Dry ground, hard dirt, no shade, no beauty. But Elena had gone outside with a shovel in her hands and dirt on her shoes, and she had started planting. Daniel remembered asking her once, when he was still a boy, "Mom, why are you planting trees if they won't do anything for years?" She had smiled softly and said, "Some things are not planted for today. They are planted for the future." At the time, Daniel had not understood that. He was just a child. Children want quick answers. They want things to make sense right away. But Elena understood something deeper. She knew that life was built by patience, one season at a time, one root at a time, one silent act of love at a time. She watered those trees in the morning. She checked their leaves after rain. She protected them when the wind came hard. And when people asked why she cared so much, she always gave the same answer. "Trees remember." That was her favorite phrase. "Trees remember." Daniel used to laugh at that. Megan, years later, would hear that same sentence and think it sounded strange. But Elena never explained it. She just kept tending to her trees like they were old friends. And over time, those trees grew taller. Their branches stretched wider. Their roots went deeper. And the yard became calmer, cooler, and more alive because of them. Still, to Megan, they were just trees. Part 2. The house changes. After Daniel married Megan, the house started changing. Not all at once. A little at a time. At first, the changes were practical. The furniture was moved around. The kitchen got new shelves. The curtains were replaced. The old things were pushed aside to make space for the new. Megan was not a cruel woman. She did not wake up every morning wanting to hurt Elena. But she had a very strong need for control. She liked things neat. She liked things efficient. She liked things the way she wanted them. And that meant Elena's habits started to bother her. The teacups placed in the same cabinet, the folded blankets on the old chair, the quiet prayers whispered in the morning, the slow steps through the hallway. Even the trees in the yard began to annoy her. Whenever Megan looked through the window and saw them swaying in the wind, she frowned. One afternoon, as she stood beside Daniel in the kitchen, she pointed outside and said, "Those trees need to go." Daniel looked surprised. "Why?" Megan crossed her arms. "They make the yard look old and cluttered. We're trying to clean this place up. They take up space." Daniel looked out the window but said nothing. At that moment, Elena was sitting quietly in her chair nearby, listening. She did not turn around. She did not interrupt. She only lowered her eyes and kept peeling an apple with slow, careful hands. But Megan noticed the silence and misunderstood it as weakness. So she kept going. "They don't even produce anything useful. No fruit, no flowers, nothing. They're just there." Elena's hands paused for a second. Just a second. Then she continued peeling. That was Elena's way. She did not fight loud battles. She endured them. But inside her, something was hurting. Because those trees were not just there. They were part of her life, part of her memory, part of a promise she had once made. And Megan had no idea. The next day, Megan brought it up again. This time at breakfast. "Daniel, I really think we should call someone to cut down those trees. The yard would look so much better." Daniel glanced at his mother. "Mom planted them," he said. Megan let out a short breath. "That was years ago. Things change. People clean up. That's normal." Elena placed her teacup down gently. Her voice was soft, but steady. "Those trees are not in the way." Megan smiled politely, but there was irritation behind it. "With respect, Mrs. Elena, they are in the way. They block sunlight, they need maintenance, and honestly, they make the place feel old." The room went quiet, very quiet. Elena looked down at her hands. Her fingers were thin now, wrinkled. Hands that had worked all her life. Hands that had carried groceries, washed clothes, fed a child, buried grief, and held on through years no one else had lived through. Then she spoke. "My trees are still standing. That is enough." Megan frowned. Daniel felt the tension growing, but he didn't step in. And that silence hurt Elena more than Megan's words. Because a daughter-in-law can speak harshly, but when your own son says nothing, that silence goes deep. Megan finally said, "Well, I think we should at least trim them down." Elena shook her head. "No, just one word. Quiet." But final. Megan's face tightened. She did not like being told no. Not by anyone. Not in her own house. So after breakfast, she pulled Daniel aside and spoke in a low voice. "We need to deal with this. Your mother is becoming impossible." Daniel looked tired. "She's not impossible. She just cares about those trees." Megan waved her hand. "It's just emotion. Sentiment. We can't let old habits control everything." Daniel rubbed his forehead. He had started to feel caught between two women he loved in very different ways. One had raised him. The other was building a life with him. And he did what many weak people do. He avoided the conflict and hoped it would disappear. But conflict never disappears when you ignore it. It only grows roots, just like those trees. A week later, Megan had reached her limit. She hired workers without truly discussing it with Elena. That morning, the sound of a truck pulling into the driveway woke the house. Elena came outside slowly, leaning on her cane. And when she saw the men carrying tools toward the trees, her face changed instantly. She turned to Daniel. "What is this?" Daniel looked uncomfortable. Megan answered before he could. We're finally cleaning up the yard. Elena's eyes widened. You hired them to cut my trees? Megan tried to stay calm. They're not your trees forever, Mrs. Elena. This is our home, too. Elena's voice trembled slightly. No, those trees are not decorations. Do not touch them. Megan's patience cracked. Why are you being so dramatic about this? They're just trees. Elena looked at her hard now. The old woman's eyes, usually soft and distant, suddenly became sharp, and she said something that made the whole yard go still. Nothing planted with love is ever just a thing. Nobody spoke after that, not even the workers. But Megan was too angry to feel the weight of Elena's words. She motioned to the men. Start with the one near the fence. Elena stepped forward. Stop. Daniel finally raised his hand. Wait. Everybody stop. The workers froze. Megan stared at him. Daniel? He looked at his mother, then at his wife. And in that moment, he had to choose whether he would keep being silent or finally be a son. He swallowed hard. Mom, he said, why are these trees so important to you? Elena closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them again, they were full of something old, something heavy, something sacred. And she said, because your grandparents told me to plant them. The yard stayed silent. Megan gave a small laugh. That's it? That's the reason? Elena shook her head. No, that is not the whole reason. She turned toward the trees and touched the trunk of the nearest one. When your father was still alive, your grandparents gave me these trees as a promise. They said if anything ever happened to our family, the roots would remember what the mouths could not say. Megan blinked. What does that even mean? Elena did not answer. Instead, she turned and looked at Daniel, and then came the sentence that changed everything. There is something buried under those roots. Daniel frowned. Buried? Elena nodded slowly. Yes. Megan folded her arms. Buried what? Elena took a deep breath. And now, for the first time, her voice became emotional. Your grandparents lived through hard years. Very hard years. They feared losing everything. So before they passed, they asked me to keep one part of the family safe. Daniel stared at her. What part? Elena looked at the ground. A treasure. Megan almost laughed again, but stopped when she saw Elena's face. She was serious. Deeply serious. Elena continued. Not all treasure is for showing off. Some treasure is for survival. Some treasure is for protection. Your grandfather hid it beneath the roots because he believed the world would change too fast, and one day the family might need something strong enough to hold us together. Daniel's jaw tightened. What kind of treasure? Elena looked at him with painful honesty. Gold, jewelry, old documents, property papers, family letters, things your grandparents believed should belong to the next generation, not to the dust. Megan's face changed. Now she was listening, really listening, because this was no longer about trees. This was about value, about money, about hidden history. Why didn't you say anything? Daniel asked. Elena answered softly, because your grandfather said the roots would be safe only as long as the trees lived. He told me, if the family forgets these trees, it means the family has forgotten itself. Daniel looked stunned. Megan looked at the workers, then at the trees, then at Daniel. And for the first time, the yard did not feel like a backyard. It felt like a vault, a memory chest, a grave of promises. Elena's eyes filled with tears. I planted them when you were small. I watered them even when my knees hurt. I protected them because they were never just trees. They were the lock on the family's past. Megan's voice dropped. Are you saying there's treasure buried under there? Elena nodded. Yes. Nobody moved for a second. Then Daniel slowly asked, how do you know it's still there? Elena answered, because I never told anyone where to look. Megan's mouth tightened. There it was. The thing she had not expected. The old woman had held a secret all these years. Not out of greed, but out of loyalty. Megan crossed her arms. So you've been sitting on this all this time? Elena looked at her calmly. I have been guarding it. That line landed hard. Guarding it. Not hiding it for herself. Not stealing it. Guarding it. As if she had been standing watch over a sleeping kingdom for decades. Daniel stared at the workers and then turned to Elena. Mom, why didn't you tell me? Elena's eyes shone with sadness. Because I wanted to tell you only when you were ready to understand what it meant. He whispered. And I wasn't? Elena reached for his hand. No, my son. You were busy learning how to survive. You did not yet know how to protect what matters. Those words hit Daniel deeply. Megan looked away. The truth was, she had never seen Elena as a guardian. Only as an old woman in her way. Now she felt ashamed. But pride is a powerful thing. And instead of apologizing right away, she said, Then let's dye it up. Elena slowly removed her hand from Daniel's. Not until you answer one question. Megan looked frustrated. What? Elena's voice turned sharp. Why did you want to cut down the trees so badly? The whole yard held its breath. Megan stood frozen, because now she had to answer honestly. And honesty is hardest when your motive is ugly. Finally, she said, Because I thought they were blocking the future. I thought they were old things standing in the way of better things. Elena nodded. And now? Megan swallowed. Now I think maybe I was wrong. That was enough for Elena. She nodded once, then digged carefully. The workers began by loosening the soil around the largest tree, very carefully. Slowly. No one rushed. The air felt heavy, as if the yard itself knew something important was about to be uncovered. Daniel held a shovel, but barely used it. Megan stood with her hands clasped tightly together, and Elena watched silently, her face pale with memory. The first roots came into view, thick, strong, twisting deep into the earth like veins carrying the family's history. Then one of the workers stopped. He had hit something, a dull metallic sound. He bent down, brushed away dirt, and called out, There's something here. Daniel stepped closer. They worked around it carefully, clearing away soil by hand now. Soon, a rusted metal box appeared, old, heavy, wrapped in layers of cloth that had nearly become part of the earth itself. Megan covered her mouth. Daniel's eyes widened. Elena shut her eyes. And for a few seconds, nobody moved. Because there are moments in life when a secret becomes real. And when it does, it changes the shape of everything. At last, Daniel lifted the box from the ground. It was bigger than he had imagined. He carried it to the porch and placed it on the table. The family gathered around it. Elena's hands trembled as she touched the lid. I remember this, she whispered. Megan leaned in, hardly breathing. Open it. Elena looked at Daniel. He nodded. Then with shaking fingers, she unlocked the old latch. The lid creaked open. And inside, wrapped in cloth and yellowed paper, was a family treasure that had waited through years of silence. There were gold coins, old jewelry, a necklace with a tiny heart-shaped charm, several envelopes tied with ribbon, property deeds, photographs, and one more thing, a letter. Elena lifted the letter first. Her hand shook so much she almost dropped it. Daniel reached to help, but she held it tighter. No, she said softly. I must read it. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was faded but still readable. And as she began to read, her voice cracked with emotion. My dearest family, if this letter is being read, it means the roots have done their work. We planted these trees not only to mark the land, but to protect what was ours when times became uncertain. We do not trust the world to remember all things with kindness. So we leave this with the one who understands patience. To the mother who waters these trees, we say thank you. To the son who may one day forget, we say remember. To the family who may one day be divided, we say this. What is buried here is not just wealth, it is responsibility. It is proof that this family survived storms before. It is a reminder that the people who come after us must not destroy what they do not understand. The roots will hold this truth until the right hands find it. Protect one another, and do not let greed bury love. Elena stopped reading. Her throat tightened. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Daniel looked away, deeply moved. Megan stood completely still. Those words were not only from the past, they were for this moment, for this exact day, because the family had almost done the very thing the letter warned against. They had almost destroyed what they did not understand. The trees, the roots, the memory, the trust. Megan finally whispered, "Oh my God." Daniel sat down slowly. His voice was low. "Mom." "All this time," Elena nodded. "All this time," he looked at the box, then at her. "You protected it alone." She gave a weak smile. "No, the trees protected it too." At first, Megan couldn't stop staring at the golden papers. But then something changed inside her, because she realized the treasure was not only money. The real treasure was that letter, the proof that the family had once loved each other enough to plan for the future, enough to sacrifice, enough to trust. And Elena had carried that trust for years, without applause, without praise, without thanks. Megan's eyes began to fill. She turned to Elena. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Elena looked at her. Megan's voice shook. "I thought you were clinging to old things just to be difficult. I thought the trees were standing in the way, but they were protecting something priceless." Elena studied her for a long moment. Then she said, "Many people call patience weakness. They are wrong." Megan nodded, crying now. "I understand that now." Daniel picked up one of the envelopes and opened it. Inside were old property papers. They showed land that had belonged to the family for generations. Not a fortune in the flashy sense, but enough to restore security, enough to help the family financially, enough to give them choices, enough to save them from the quiet pressure that had been building over the years. Daniel looked at Elena in disbelief. "Mom, this could have changed everything." Elena smiled sadly. "It still can." Then she pointed to the trees. "But only if you remember why they were planted." And in that moment, Daniel finally understood. Those trees were never just about the land. They were a lesson, a warning, a monument to the kind of love that does not shout, a love that works in silence, a love that protects without asking for credit. After that day, the house changed again. But this time, the change was different, better. The trees stayed. Of course they stayed. No one mentioned cutting them down again. In fact, Daniel began caring for them with new respect. He watered them every morning. He cleared the soil around their roots. He repaired the fence near the yard. Megan started helping too. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. She began spending more time with Elena, listening instead of rushing, asking questions instead of assuming. And slowly, something soft and broken inside the family began to knit back together. One evening, Megan brought tea to Elena outside under the trees. The air was cool. The branches moved gently overhead, and the yard looked peaceful in a way it never had before. Megan sat beside her and said, "I used to think old things were only holding us back." Elena took a slow sip of tea. "And now?" Megan smiled faintly. "Now I think some old things are holding us together." Elena looked at her for a long time, then nodded. "Yes, some roots are meant to stay, That line stayed in the air like a prayer. Some roots are meant to stay. Daniel heard it too from the doorway and felt something in his chest loosen. For years, he had been drifting, pulled, between the past and the future, between loyalty and convenience, between comfort and responsibility. But now he knew. His family had not been built by accident. It had been built by people who carried burdens quietly, people who planted trees when no one believed they mattered, people who guarded hope even when no one was watching. And suddenly, the old yard did not feel small anymore. It felt sacred. And that question stayed in the air. Because once a family sees the truth, they can never go back to pretending they never knew. That evening, after the tea, after the silence, after the box had been carried safely inside, nobody in that house slept peacefully. Daniel kept walking from room to room. Megan sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the old papers spread out in front of her. And Elena sat in her chair near the window, looking out at the trees like they were old friends she had nearly lost. Outside, the wind moved through the branches gently, softly, like a hand touching a scar. The whole house felt different now, not because of the treasure, but because truth had finally entered the room. And truth does that. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits quietly with you until your excuses run out. The next morning, Daniel carried the box to the dining table again. This time, he did not look at it like a pile of valuables. He looked at it like a message from people who had lived before him, a message from a family he only half understood. He opened the envelopes one by one. Inside were more letters, old photographs, receipts, a map of the property, and notes written in careful, shaky handwriting. Elena sat nearby and watched him read. One paper said the family had once nearly lost the land during a difficult time. Another paper showed that a small portion of the property had quietly been transferred in the family's name, protected from outsiders. There were also savings bonds from decades ago. Small pieces of security. Small pieces of foresight. The kind of things poor or struggling people hide because they understand life can turn without warning. Megan picked up one photograph. It showed Elena as a young woman standing beside the same trees, only much smaller then. Her hair was tied back. Her face was thinner. Her eyes were tired even then. But there was strength in her posture. A kind of quiet pride. Megan looked at it and whispered, "You were so young." Elena nodded. "Yes." Megan looked at the trees outside. "You planted them that long ago?" Elena answered, "The year your husband was born." Daniel looked up. "You mean these trees are as old as me?" Elena smiled faintly. "Yes, my son, almost." He sat back, stunned. For a moment, none of them spoke. And that silence was not cruel anymore. It was respectful. Because now they understood the trees were not just part of the yard. They were part of the family timeline. They had witnessed births, deaths, arguments, meals, prayers, heartbreak, and survival. They had stood there through everything. And somehow, they had kept the secret safe. Megan finally asked the question she should have asked long ago. "Why did your parents trust you with this?" Elena folded her hands in her lap. For a long time, she said nothing. Then at last, she began to speak. Her voice was slow and soft, like someone opening a door to a room they had not entered in years. "Because I was the only one who stayed." Daniel looked at her. The words were simple, but heavy. Elena continued, "Your grandfather had brothers. There was fighting in the family. Some wanted money, some wanted land, some wanted nothing but control. When hard times came, everyone started thinking only about themselves." She paused. "But your grandmother believed in one thing, that the family would survive only if someone kept the heart of it safe." Megan listened carefully now. Elena went on, Your grandfather and grandmother chose me because I was not loud. I was not greedy. I was not easily tempted. I was stubborn, yes, but in the right way. I could keep a promise. Daniel lowered his head a little. Elena looked at him kindly, and I did. Her eyes shone with old pain. I buried the box under the roots because I knew no one would look there. I planted the trees not only to hide it, but to honor them. They believed the future should grow out of the past, not destroy it. Megan swallowed hard. Then quietly she said, I almost destroyed it. Elena turned to her. Yes, no anger, no shouting, just truth. That was somehow worse, and somehow kinder, because Elena was not interested in punishing Megan. She was trying to teach her. Daniel had been listening with his head down, his hands clenched together. Finally, he looked up. His eyes were red, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of regret that has been waiting too long to be released. Mom, I should have protected those trees. Elena said nothing. He continued, I should have listened when you said no. Still, she said nothing. I let her pressure you. I let everything go too far. Now Elena's expression softened. Daniel. But he shook his head. No. Let me say this. He took a breath. I was trying so hard to keep peace that I forgot peace is not the same as silence. I should have stood beside you. The room became still again. Megan looked at him. She knew he was speaking not only to Elena, but also to himself. He had failed in a quiet way, the kind of failure that people often excuse because it does not look dramatic. But Elena knew that kind of failure very well, and she also knew how healing begins, with honesty. So she reached across the table and touched his hand. I know, my son. Daniel looked up at her. She gave him a small, tired smile. You are here now. And that was enough to break him. He bent his head and cried. Not loud, not childish, just silent tears from a grown man who had finally realized how much love he had nearly allowed to be buried. Megan watched him cry and felt her own chest tighten, because in that moment, she saw him not as her husband, but as a son who had lost his footing. And she saw Elena not as an obstacle, but as a woman who had carried 3 generations on her back without asking anyone to notice. That night, Megan could not sleep either. She kept thinking about her own words. We should cut them down. It's just old stuff. They're in the way. Now those words sounded harsh to her, not because they were loud, but because they were careless. And careless words can wound deeper than cruel ones sometimes. The next morning, she went outside before sunrise. The air was cool. The yard was quiet. The trees stood above her like dark shapes against the sky. She touched the trunk of the nearest one. The bark was rough beneath her palm. Real, solid, alive. And for the first time, she did not see an old tree. She saw time, patience, faith. She saw Elena standing in the same yard years ago, planting something that no one else valued. She saw a woman who had believed in tomorrow even when today was heavy. Megan closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she whispered, I get it now. Then she did something she had never done before. She apologized to the trees. It sounds strange, maybe, but sometimes we need to speak to the things we have nearly destroyed, as if saying sorry to the object helps us understand the heart behind it. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't know. And from the porch, Elena heard her. She did not interrupt. She only sat there quietly, holding her teacup, allowing the moment to breathe. Because some apologies need space, and some healing begins when the proud person finally learns how to kneel inside their own soul. Later that week, the family had a long conversation, not an argument. A real conversation, the kind they should have had years earlier. Daniel wanted to put the money toward fixing the house. Megan wanted to save part of it. Elena, however, had another idea. She placed the old letter on the table and said, "This was never meant to make us rich. It was meant to keep us strong." Daniel asked, "What do you mean?" She answered, "We use it carefully. For the family. For the future. For something that lasts." Megan nodded slowly. "So not for luxury." Elena shook her head. "No. For roots." That word again. Roots. Everything kept coming back to roots. Because roots are what hold a tree up. And roots are what hold a family together too. The family agreed to use part of the treasure to repair the home, settle old debts, and create a small safety fund. The rest they would preserve, not spend carelessly. But there was one more thing Elena insisted on. She wanted to keep the trees, not trim them down, not replace them, not improve them. Keep them exactly as they were, with all their history intact. And this time, nobody argued. A few days later, the house felt calmer. Daniel had repaired the fence. Megan had cleared the porch. The workers who had been hired to cut the trees were gone. The old box was now safely locked away. But the most important change was not visible. It was emotional. It lived in the way people looked at one another now. More carefully, more respectfully. One afternoon, Elena sat under the shade of the trees with a blanket across her knees. Daniel pulled up a chair beside her. Megan brought water and sat on the other side. For a long time, they said nothing. The kind of silence that used to feel cold now felt warm. The trees rustled softly overhead. A bird called from the fence. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and then fell quiet. Elena looked up at the branches and said, "When a tree grows, people only see the leaves." Daniel nodded. "But," she smiled, "but the real work is underground." Megan looked at the soil near the roots. "The roots." "Yes," Elena said. "The roots do most of the holding." Daniel leaned back and stared into the sky. He thought about his life. How much time had he spent chasing the visible things? Money, image, convenience, quiet control, peace at any cost. And how little time had he spent honoring the unseen things? Patience, sacrifice, memory, faith, love that does not ask to be noticed. He looked at his mother and said, "I think I understand now." Elena turned to him. "Yes?" He nodded. These trees were never just protecting treasure. They were teaching us how to live. Elena smiled, and this time the smile was warm all the way through. "Yes, my son. That is exactly what they were doing." Months passed, and life, as it does, kept moving. The house was repaired. The family debt eased. The treasure was organized carefully, with respect. But the biggest transformation was in the yard. The trees flourished. New leaves grew. Their shadows stretched across the grass in the afternoon sun. Birds nested in the branches. And the family began spending more time outside, talking, laughing softly, eating meals together when they could. Even neighbors started noticing something different about the house. It no longer looked tired. It looked rooted. One day, a neighbor asked Megan, "Why didn't you cut those trees down? They'd have made the yard look cleaner." Megan smiled, and for the first time, she answered with certainty, "Because some things are worth more than a clean look." The neighbor looked confused, but Megan didn't explain. She didn't need to, because she had finally learned the kind of lesson that cannot be rushed into words. Some things only become clear after they nearly disappear, and that is why they matter. One evening, as the sun began to set, Elena called Daniel and Megan outside. The sky was orange and soft. The branches above them glowed in the fading light. She stood slowly with help from Daniel, then looked at the trees one by one. And she said, "These trees will outlive me." Daniel frowned. "Don't say that." Elena smiled gently. It is not a sad thing. It is a true thing. Megan looked away, emotional. Elena continued, when I am gone, they will still stand here. And when your children are grown, maybe they will ask about them. And when they do, tell them the truth. Daniel nodded. What truth? She looked at him. That love is not always loud. That love can look like planting trees in silence, like keeping a box buried for decades, like forgiving someone before they deserve it, like staying when leaving would be easier, like holding on to a promise no one else remembers. Megan wiped her eyes. Elena's voice grew even softer. Tell them that their family was not saved by money alone. It was saved by patience, by memory, by roots. Daniel took her hand tightly. I'll tell them. Elena nodded. Good. But even after all that, the story did not end there, because healing does not happen in one day. An understanding does not stay alive unless you practice it. The family had found the treasure. They had read the letter. They had kept the trees. But now came the harder part. They had to live differently. They had to become the kind of people worthy of what had been protected for them. And that is where the real story begins. In the weeks after that day, Daniel changed. Not in some dramatic movie-style way. Not with big speeches. Not with loud promises. His change was quieter than that. More real. He began coming home earlier. He started asking Elena about the old days. Not just once. Not just out of guilt. He asked because now he cared. He wanted to know what kind of woman she had been before age bent her shoulders. He wanted to know what his grandparents were like. He wanted to know what stories lived in the family before he arrived. And Elena, who had spent so many years being ignored, finally had someone listening, really listening. Sometimes she would tell him small things, how she met his father, how his grandfather used to hum while fixing the radio, how his grandmother kept old recipes folded inside a blue notebook, how hard it had been to keep the house standing through seasons when money was scarce and hope was even scarcer. Daniel would sit beside her and listen with his hands folded, like a child learning the family language all over again. Because that was what it was, a language. The language of memory, the language of roots, the language of people who survive by holding each other up. Megan changed too, and honestly, hers was the more difficult change, because Daniel had grown up with Elena. He had history with her, but Megan had entered this home like a stranger with opinions. She had judged too quickly. She had mistaken silence for weakness. She had confused patience with obedience. Now she had to live with that truth. And some truths are heavy, but instead of running from it, she stayed with it. She began helping Elena in the kitchen. She learned the way Elena liked tea brewed. She asked about the old photographs. She even learned how to preserve some of the old family papers properly so they would not decay with time. One evening, while folding laundry, Megan said quietly, I think I was afraid of anything that didn't fit my idea of a better life. Elena looked over from her chair. And now? Megan folded the shirt in her hands and smiled a little. Now, I think a better life is not always newer. Sometimes it is deeper. Elena nodded slowly. Yes, she said. Deeper lives last longer. That sentence settled into the room like warm light. Because it was true. A shallow life might shine for a moment, but a deep life holds through storms. Soon the house became a place where people no longer rushed each other. That sounds small, but it matters. People slowed down. They knocked before entering rooms. They asked before moving things. They paid attention. And in that attention, love began growing again. One afternoon, Daniel found Elena standing by the window, watching the trees. He walked up beside her and asked, What are you thinking about? She smiled faintly. I am thinking that trees grow slowly. but they do not apologize for it. Daniel laughed softly. That sounds like something you would say. Elena tilted her head. It is something I learned long ago. Daniel looked outside. The trees were tall now, strong, full. Their leaves moved like quiet waves. He said, I used to think strength was loud. Elena glanced at him. And now? He answered, now I think strength is what stays standing when nobody claps. Elena's eyes softened. That is a very good thing to understand. Daniel turned to her. I should have understood it sooner. Elena touched his arm. You understood it when it mattered. And that was her gift. She never made people feel too late to grow. She corrected them, yes. She taught them, yes. But she also left room for redemption. And that is a rare kind of love. Months later, they decided to create something meaningful, with part of the inherited value, not something flashy, not something to show off, something lasting. They used a portion of the family resources to repair the home, preserve the old documents, and create a small fund for future generations. But they also did something else. They placed a small brass plaque near the trees. Not too big, not dramatic, just enough to honor what the roots had held. It read, planted in love, protected by memory, preserved for the future. When Megan saw it finished, she stood quietly for a long time. Then she said, this feels right. Daniel nodded. It does. Elena, standing beside them, looked at the plaque and then at the trees. She did not smile widely. She was too humble for that. But there was peace on her face. The kind of peace that comes when a promise has finally been honored. And that is why this story stays in your heart. Not because of the gold. Not because of the hidden papers. Not even because of the shocking discovery. It stays because of the woman. The old woman who planted ordinary trees when nobody thought they mattered. The woman who kept a family secret alive without asking for praise. The woman who understood something most people forget. That the future is not built by destroying the past. It is built by respecting it. She was not trying to control anyone. She was trying to protect something sacred. And for years, the family did not understand. They saw a yard. She saw a legacy. They saw clutter. She saw a shelter. They saw old roots. She saw memory. That is the difference between looking and truly seeing. So if you ever find yourself rushing to remove something old, something quiet, something ordinary, stop for a second. Ask what it has protected. Ask what it has witnessed. Ask who loved it enough to keep it alive. Because sometimes the thing standing in your way is not an obstacle. Sometimes it is a guardian. Sometimes the person everyone ignores is the one holding the family together. And sometimes the roots beneath the ground are carrying more truth than the people walking above them. The trees in this story were never ordinary. They were the family's memory, their safety, their inheritance. And the old woman who planted them was never weak. She was strong in the deepest way possible. The kind of strong that does not demand attention. The kind that remains when everything else changes. The kind that protects love quietly until the day someone finally understands. So remember this. Before you cut down what looks useless, make sure it is not the very thing holding your life together. Because sometimes the roots know the truth long before we do.